In August, we flew to Sabah, Borneo. Borneo is the world's third largest island and is shared by the Malaysian states of Sabah and Sarawak, Indonesian Kalimantan, and the tiny nation of Brunei. The trip was organised and led by Julia and Alan Landford, who run Nature Art Lab, based in Canberra. We arrived in Kota Kinabalu, the capital of Sabah, which lies between the hills and the coast, and walked to the harbour to watch the sunset. This spot by the Filipino market is the only place in Borneo where house crows have become established. Next day we had a free morning, so we walked along the coast to Tanjung Aru Beach, experiencing our first tropical downpour and noting some familiar Australian bird species. The Wallace Line, delineating Australian and Southeast Asian faunal species, runs just east of Borneo. This means for birds that may have been able to travel over water, Borneo is something of a transitional zone. There are no woodpeckers in Australia, and the sparrows and starlings look familiar but are different species. Similarly, the zebra dove is closely related to the Australian peaceful dove. It's a fascinating mix. We were delighted to spot these Java finches, a beautiful Southeast Asian finch whose numbers have been greatly reduced by the pet trade. As it was hot and humid, we were pleased to reach the beach and enjoy a refreshing sea breeze while we looked around. We spotted the ubiquitous yellow-vented bulbul, a large monitor lizard, and the bright yellow common iora. In the afternoon, we began the official trip by visiting the mangrove habitat of Kota Kinabalu wetland and were introduced to our guide, Asmil. By evening, we were back at Tanjung Aru Beach with our guide this time so that we didn't miss the target birds, the first being blue-naped parrot. The small population here was established from the deliberate release of captive birds from a nearby market. The population is maintained at around 30 to 50 by the shortage of suitable nest holes in the casuarina trees. Then, in the nearby trees, long-tailed parakeet. Although, whoops, this must be an adolescent or had an accident with its tail. This bird shows the full, elegant plumage from which its name derives. A very early start next morning to drive to Mount Kinabalu in the northeast of the island, the highest mountain in Southeast Asia at over 4,000 metres, and on the way to spend the morning at the wonderful Tambunan Bulwar's pheasant hide. This is a thoughtfully designed hide, complete with a water source and food for the birds, and very comfortable amenities for observers. It looks out into rainforest on the slopes of the Crocker Range. Its star attraction is Bulwar's pheasant, which didn't show that morning, reminding us that these are wild birds, but there were plenty of other beautiful species to keep us fascinated. Emerald dove, another species with which we're familiar in Australia. A pair of crested partridge. This dazzling but very wary ground bird is almost impossible to see clearly from the rainforest trails. A feature of this trip was the ongoing nature journaling. We were encouraged to look closely at everything we saw, and those who wanted could record their observations in their journals and receive expert help in specimen ID and tuition from the talented and enthusiastic Nature Art Lab team. But we were doing it the easy way with cameras, so it was back to filming in the hide to enjoy the ongoing parade of brilliant birds and other wildlife. The vibrant Bornean banded pitta is another bird that is extremely difficult to see hopping about on the forest floor, despite its vivid colours. To see it relaxed and bathing was an amazing experience. Our next stop was Gunung Alab substation at an altitude of about 2,000 metres, where we scrambled down a muddy slope to a rudimentary hide for a chance to see red-breasted partridge. To our delight, and despite the drizzly conditions, Asmil managed to coax in a small party of these well-camouflaged ground birds. There was also a family of snowy-browed flycatchers flitting about. We then walked down the track to the car park, enjoying views of birds as well as expert commentary on various plant species from Tanya, the professional botanist in the group. And here's our first flower pecker, a Bornean endemic. And our first barbet, also an endemic and difficult to spot. Its colouring makes it almost invisible. In the evening we arrived at our accommodation in Kundasang at the foot of Mount Kinabalu and were enchanted by the stunning views of the mountain. Next morning in the gardens we found ornate sunbird, looking identical to the Australian olive-backed sunbird. Then we were off up the mountain to Mount Kinabalu Park, taking in the amazing scenery on the way up. There were dozens of climbers ready to make the 2-day ascent to the 4,000 metre summit. We were driven about a kilometre up the mountain and walked slowly down, appreciating the amazing lushness of the rainforest and the cool mountain air, and sighting a tiny montane endemic, Bornean stubtail. Asmal spotted the mossy nest of Whitehead's Broadbill. We walked back down to the botanical garden, which holds some very rare orchids and a variety of fascinating unfamiliar plant families, together with insects and birds. Particularly interesting were the Nepenthes, the insectivorous pitcher plants, which occur widely in Southeast Asia. Australia has only 3 species, found in far north Queensland. After a delicious lunch, there was an art workshop for the nature journalers to work on recent sightings. We opted to go back up the mountain and were lucky enough to spot 3 stunning Whitehead Trogons, which treated us to marvellous close views. In the misty late afternoon, the whole group walked up the mountain, and this time the Whitehead's Broadbill was attending its nest. This is one of the most sought-after birds on the mountain, and to watch it putting the finishing touches to its nest was a rare and fascinating sight. Next morning, we were back at the excellent Lagawu restaurant beside the botanical garden for breakfast, where we were joined by the huge tropical swallowtail moth. Afterwards, we were driven up to the end of the road at a higher altitude than the day before. As well as magnificent views, there was plenty of wildlife, the whistling thrush again. This butterfly was puddling, absorbing vital dissolved minerals from the small shallow puddle through its proboscis. A pale giant squirrel was running lithely through the trees overhead, while below was an eye-browed jungle flycatcher. And a grey-throated babbler. After lunch, the nature journalist had plenty of new specimens to record, while some of us chose to ramble about, looking at whatever turned up. There was always something in this fascinating habitat. Lucky last bird as we were about to board the buses, our second barbet. We drove back via the enormous Kundasang markets to marvel at and sample the huge variety of exotic fruits and vegetables and gaze at the fish and other offerings for sale. The next day we left the mountains on our way to Sepilok via pouring hot springs. We were looking for a spot where an ephemeral Rafflesia might be flowering. It starts to rot after 6 days. The biggest flower in the world, it can reach 1 metre across, but has no stems, leaves or roots, and grows as a parasitic plant on the rotting tissue of a particular vine on the jungle ground. Its stink of rotting flesh attracts flies to enable pollination. From there to pouring hot springs. More birds, including our third barbet. Seeing a Raja Brooks birdwing was a personal thrill. After another delicious lunch, it was a long drive to Sepilok. We arrived at dusk. In the morning, we had the excitement of waking up in a new environment with a whole new suite of birds, plants and animals. Hello to our first orangutan in the trees above us. A delightful start to the day. The lodge featured an eating area overlooking a small lake, which was attractive to many birds and other wildlife. In came our first hornbill of the trip, the very impressive rhinoceros hornbill, one of the largest of the hornbills. After breakfast, we headed to the Bornean Sun Bear Conservation Centre and heard a passionate description of the need to rescue and rehabilitate this threatened species from Dr. Wong, the founder of the facility. Sun bears are the smallest bears in the world and are only found in Southeast Asia. They continue to be threatened by forest degradation, illegal hunting for bear parts and poaching to obtain young cubs for the pet trade. Like most bears, it seems, they love honey and have evolved just the right tongue for licking it out of hives high up in forest trees. On our way out, we spotted a beautiful but deadly arboreal snake. Up the road is the Orangutan Rehabilitation Centre, which has much the same aims of rescue, research, rehabilitation and reintroduction to the wild. There's an enclosed nursery area where it was fun to view the youngsters being taught the skills of survival in the wild in a protected environment. Close by is the Rainforest Discovery Centre, 4,300 hectares of rainforest where the orangutans are truly in the wild. This vast area of rainforest has many trails and an amazing canopy walkway featuring even higher towers. At the top of one of these towers we were eye to eye with a Wallace's hawk eagle on its nest. As evening fell, we waited on a walkway to see the nocturnal giant red flying squirrel emerge and glide between the trees. We continued on a night walk along the trails for nocturnal creatures such as this exquisite lantern bug and another Bornean-keeled pit viper. At breakfast next morning, there was a loud, harsh cry as a black hornbill flew in. Then we were back on the boardwalk at the Discovery Centre for more birds. At ground level, we waited on a trail to see if Asmal could coax in the rare Sabah partridge. At last, this dazzling bird strutted in cautiously and stood on a rock to loudly proclaim its territory. Tanya, a botanist and artist, quickly sketched it from life, a very impressive accomplishment. Farther along the forest track was a brilliantly coloured crimson sunbird. And a glowering pig-tailed macaque. Back at the lodge, we went for a late afternoon stroll. The orangutans have a liking for swooping on piles of linen left beside the cabins and waving it about in the trees as if it's one of the large leaves from which they make their beds each night. Below, in the car park, a pair of gorgeous ruby-cheeked sunbirds were sadly wasting their energy by taking issue with their doppelgangers in the glass. Farther down the road were chestnut munias enjoying a puddle. A juvenile glossy starling, white-breasted waterhen, and, always a treat for Australians, a woodpecker, a good way to finish the walk. The next morning we left Sepilok, heading for the Kinabatangan River. On the way, we stopped at the famous Gomantong caves to explore the Simud Hitam cave. On the way in, Asmal spotted this small babbler. Babblers are a very large family of birds of tropical areas and look very different to Australian babblers. Outside the immense limestone cave is housing for the harvesters of the edible nest swiftlets' nests, made from the bird's saliva and harvested twice a year. Inside, the walls are blanketed with cockroaches and bats, and we had to carefully negotiate the cockroach-covered walkways to avoid slipping into the smelly guano below, made of bird and bat droppings and innumerable dead insects. White nests of edible nest swiftlets are extremely valuable. In fact, the most expensive animal product consumed by humans, but soup was the last thing on our minds. Emerging into the fresh air, we had a great view of a crested serpent eagle. Arriving at the Kinabatangan River, we were ferried by boat to our lodge and immediately became aware of the variety of wildlife in another exciting new environment. After lunch and time for updating nature journals, we were straight onto the river, which is a wonderful showcase for close views of primates. The first was the pretty silvered leaf monkey, aka the silvery lutang or silvery langur. This troop of the gregarious long-tailed macaque were immensely engaging with their unself-conscious interactions. The large Proboscis monkey has partially webbed back feet and is an excellent swimmer. Females have an up-tilted nose and smaller stomachs than the male's impressively prominent belly. It's the male's awesome snozzle from which the name derives. Cruising is also a great way to glide up close to perching birds. We were back on the river after dinner, spotlighting for more birds. Early the next morning, we were gliding along again. One of the most thrilling birds of the trip was this storm stork, a truly magnificent bird of which sadly it's estimated there are fewer than 500 left. After lunch and time to explore or work on nature journals, we were back on the river. Another hornbill species, bushy crested hornbill. Trampled vegetation was evidence that Bornean pygmy elephants had passed through. An orangutan was the showstopper. Another species of cave swiftlets, but without the cockroaches. Back on land for a night walk in the rainforest and a large frogmouth. Next morning it was time to leave and be ferried back to our buses for the long drive to our last destination, Imbak Canyon. Palm oil plantations make up 27% of Sabah. Thankfully, the government has now committed to no new deforestation for palm oil. At Kampung Imbak, we changed into four-wheel drive vehicles for the last 2 hours of the trip. Imbak Canyon is surrounded by completely untouched primary rainforest with immensely tall trees since it's never been logged. After lunch, we drove into the rainforest and then walked to the impressive Imbak Falls for our initial exploration. At night, we drove out again on safari vehicles to spot wildlife. The huge-eyed slow loris is too cute for its own good. Since becoming an internet favourite, it's now endangered, thanks to the pet trade. A nocturnal cat, a civet. A gorgeous little snake we spotted while walking. In the morning, we went with our guides looking for birds around the accommodation. First up was another hornbill species. Pygmy elephants had visited a couple of days earlier. Shaky suspension bridges to cross, then a great find, the magnificent feather of a great argus, causing excitement among the nature journalists eager to try to accurately depict its exquisitely delicate colouring with the help of Zoe, a professional nature illustrator. The lovely plangent whoops and calls of gibbons were one of the loudest morning sounds as they swung agilely about in the highest trees. Just look at the height of these trees. Asmil found another gorgeous pitta glowing in gem-like colours on the rainforest floor. A family of great slaty woodpeckers flew in, the largest woodpecker in the world. It's confined to pristine forests with an abundance of tall trees, where it can forage on termites and stingless bees' nests. They put on quite a show, which we all thoroughly enjoyed. A fantastic sighting for a trip filled with excitement, wonder, and the joy of discovery.